Okay, I appreciate the opportunity to visit a little bit about preconditioning and backgrounding beef calves. My name is David Sechrist, and I am the beef cattle extension specialist for Utah State. We'll start off a little bit talking about some basic ruminant physiology. Won't go into too much detail, but I think it's important to get a little bit of background on what's going on in the rumen and also a little bit of nutritional background as we go into this topic. First of all, the rumen is just a giant fermentation vat. And so mature cow capacity of the rumen is going to be around 50 gallons. Holds a lot of water. And it's important to know that 70 to 90% of the diet is digested in the rumen, and that depends on what the animal is actually eating. But a great portion, and certainly the forage portion of the animal's diet, is digested in the rumen. What's going on there is microbial fermentation. There's microbes in the rumen that's breaking down the feed, especially the forage component, as well as protein and any grains that might be in a diet or other concentrates. And they're breaking those down into volatile fatty acids, or what we call VFAs. And that's really kind of the energy currency of a ruminant animal. Those are absorbed, and the animal utilizes that for energy. The other thing is that's produced in the rumen is microbial protein, and that really amounts to the microbes being washed through the rumen and back into the rest of the digestive tract, and those microbes are broken down and utilized as a protein source. Also, a really important source of protein for the animal, and we'll discuss a little bit later how that comes into play. In the rumen, there are microbes that digest mainly starch and those that digest mainly fiber. And this is important to understand when we're moving cattle from a high forage diet to a diet that contains more starch. We want to be careful as we do that and give the microbes in the rumen time to adjust. If they don't have enough time to adjust, you can actually cause some digestive upset in the cattle. So we'll cover most of these points in a little bit more detail, but the animal has basic nutritional needs of water, energy, protein. In the case of a ruminant, obviously they need roughage. There's needs for fats, minerals, and vitamins, and we'll cover a few of these things as we're going through. First, we talk about water. Oftentimes, water is easily overlooked and we take it for granted, but it's the most important nutrient in performance. Uh, it makes up 70% of the animal's weight. And requirements for water are really unrestricted access. And it's important to note that as feed intake drops with, uh, or the feed intake drops with dropping water intake. Bottom line being that if there's no water, there'll be no water consumption, there will be no feed consumption. Animals will consume, a mature animal, around 12 gallons of water at a fairly neutral a day, at fairly neutral environmental conditions, around 70 degrees, but that can certainly double as it gets warmer. And the bottom line is, especially any cattle we want to get good performance and health out of, which is really all of them, I guess. We want to make sure that they have all the water they want to drink. Quality is important. It's important to have clean water, and clean water improves intake. There's been a lot of research done on this area, and some of the things you might see in a practical environment. There'll be areas that have high saline water. You can have pH issues, either high or low. Oftentimes we see sulfur being high in water to the point where you can actually smell it. That can decrease water intake as well as cause problems and antagonisms with some trace mineral uptake. High in iron or nitrates, all of these things can decrease water intake, which will hurt performance on the cattle. So make sure that you know your water sources and how clean they are and what kind of issues you might have so you can mitigate any problems with water. Energy. Most of the energy comes in the diet in terms of carbohydrates in the diet. And those can be either structural carbohydrates, which we'd see what makes up the plant cell wall or the fiber component of the plant, and that adds the structure to the plant and allows the plant to stand up. And then there are non-structural carbohydrates, which are really the contents inside the cells of the plant, as well as grains, things like starch, sugars, and even some fat in plants comes in the form of non-structural carbohydrates. Again, these are mainly digested in the rumen, as we talked about earlier, producing VFAs, microbial protein, and of course gas and heat. And so we're looking at an energy level in the diet. These are just general rules of thumb, and I'll give a few of those to you as we go through. Not meant to be set in stone, but just meant to give you an idea of the levels of energy and protein and so forth that should be in the diet. And we're looking at for a grower diet or a diet that you'd be weaning calves on, you're going to want to have between 45 and 55 megacalories per pound of net energy gain. And that should give your animals good healthy growth. So protein is made up of amino acid chains. And the sources of essential amino acids in the diet come from microbial protein or dietary protein. Now, microbial protein in and of itself isn't sufficient for the high performance we're looking for in the feedlot or even for lactating cows. And so we need to add a little bit of protein in terms of dietary protein. We're looking at either rumen digestible protein, and that just adds a higher level of protein. But in general, when we feed rumen digestible protein, the microbes in the rumen break it down, and you end up with a fairly similar amino acid component going onto the animal, onto the small intestine, where it is further broken down and absorbed. Or we can have protein that is actually bypasses rumen degradation and provides some essential amino acids directly to the small intestine. You can also feed what are known as protected amino acids, and these are specific amino acids that are protected from rumen degradation and are absorbed farther down the digestive tract. We mainly see this in dairy diets. There's not much research to support performance in beef cattle of feeding protected amino acids, but certainly in dairy diets we've seen that. So as far as sources of protein, we really break down into natural protein sources and then what would be known as non-protein nitrogen or NPN. Natural sources can come from a lot of different sources, and I just name a few here. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but one of them that's really highly available in this part of the country is alfalfa hay. Alfalfa can be a good source of additional protein in the diet. You've got dry distillers grains or wet distillers, but mostly in the West, we're not close to a lot of ethanol plants, and so that product is dried down, known as DDG. There's soybean meal, canola meal, cottonseed meal, and many others that are good sources of natural protein. And then you've got your NPN, non-protein nitrogen, and really here we're talking about urea. It can be cheap, much cheaper than natural protein, and is very useful in small quantities. So under the direction of a nutritionist, you can get a nice mix of some natural protein along with some NPN to cheapen up the diet a little bit and really be an economical way to solve your protein issues. The nice thing about the NPN is it provides nitrogen directly to the rumen microbes. And so because those microbes are breaking down the feeds, they need that nitrogen. And then as they grow and proliferate, they produce more microbial protein that's available to the animal. In general, you're looking at a crude protein level in the ration of cattle in these grower or weaning type situations between 13 and 16% on a dry matter basis. Once again, these are ballpark numbers, but just to give you an idea of what kind of a protein you need to wean your calves on and having a grower diet, this is a pretty good rule of thumb. Okay, minerals. Boy, we could spend a lot of time talking about both the macro and trace minerals. I'm going to hit them lightly here. we've got salt, which all animals need, and it's really the only mineral that cattle will seek out. There's been a lot of research done seeing if cattle will actually seek out minerals that they need, and salt is really the only one. You're looking at between 0.2 and 0.3% of the diet dry matter if you're feeding a ration that's going to be totally mixed, or if you're providing salt through the feed. Otherwise, you could just make free salt available and let the cattle eat all that they want to eat. As far as calcium, calcium is pretty high in a lot of forages, but the more concentrate or grain you have in a diet, you may need to supplement some calcium. And again, ballpark number there would be about 0.5% in the diet. Phosphorus is fairly high in grains. Um, in a grazing situation, you're going to need to add more phosphorus, but the more grain in the diet, probably the less phosphorus you need to add. Looking at around 0.2%, the diet dry matter being phosphorus, but it's important to remember that you want a calcium to phosphorus ratio of about 2 to 1, meaning about twice as much calcium as phosphorus. And having both of these in harmony with one another makes a big difference in cattle performance, and is something that you and your nutritionist need to make sure is in line. And I'm sure any nutritionist that you work with is going to know that. All right, and magnesium, usually pretty adequate in most forages, but when we're looking at feeding it in the diet, we'll just need to make sure if we're testing our forage that we've got adequate magnesium levels. Kind of a lower end NRC requirement for magnesium is around 0.1% of the diet dry matter. Potassium may also need to be supplemented with lower quality forages. Alfalfa typically has a lot of potassium, and likely you would not need to supplement potassium if you're feeding a lot of alfalfa, but you're going to want to look for it to be around 0.6% of the diet. Excess potassium, as you might see at times in really high quality alfalfa hay, can actually cause the cattle to get really loose. So it's something to be aware of both on the high and on the low end. Sulfur, really don't normally need to supplement sulfur, but I bring it up and I mentioned it with the water, is that when it's in excess, it can negatively affect ruminal digestion, and also the absorption of very critical trace minerals, both copper and zinc. So we want to be aware of that. Make sure you test your water, and then some feeds are fairly high in sulfur, like DDG, which is not in and of itself an issue. But if you couple that with high sulfur in the water and some other problems, you just want to be aware of your sulfur level and not get too high. Just quickly on some vitamins and trace minerals. And in general, these vitamins and trace minerals are usually deficient especially if you've got your cattle and you're providing all the feed for them, usually deficient and requires some sort of supplementation for optimal production. In general, these trace minerals I'll list for you are really critical in immune function and just overall health and for the growth of the animal. So trace minerals that we typically will be concerned about, and this is not an exclusive list. You could add to that, but generally we'll look at copper, iodine, manganese, selenium, and zinc. The levels I've listed here are in parts per million, and so you don't need a lot of them, but you do need to make sure that we've got levels at least as I'm showing here to cover all your trace mineral needs. There may be reason to feed some of these trace minerals are at a little higher level. Again, these are just numbers that are in the neighborhood of NRC required trace mineral levels. All right, if you're looking at the sources of these trace minerals, you can get copper sulfate or copper oxide and so forth. And generally, the sulfate forms are better absorbed than the oxide forms. So as you're talking to your feed company representative or whoever you might be working with on your nutrition program, you're going to want to look for the sulfate forms of these rather than the oxides. Another way to provide the trace minerals is through what's called an organic or chelated source. They're a fair amount more expensive, but they're actually attached in the case of copper or zinc or the others, are attached to an organic molecule that is more easily absorbed by the animal, so your absorption can be higher. And this is especially critical when you know you've got some antagonisms going on, say high sulfur or high iron in your water or other parts of your diet that might antagonize the absorption of some of these other trace minerals, particularly copper and zinc. And so, and then also when you've got animals in a higher stress condition, such as your weaning calves, that they can make a pretty big difference. And then just in general, vitamins, when you're looking at, say, a 550-pound calf, I've got some levels there. Vitamin A at about 25,000 IUs a day, vitamin D about 1,500, and vitamin E about 400 IUs per day. The requirement for vitamin E during normal production is probably closer to 100 or maybe even a little bit lower. But when we're looking at the stress of weaning and early in the growth period, when an animal is just getting acclimated to feed and coming and starting to grow, that higher level of vitamin E can be really helpful to the immune system. Okay, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about dry matter intake. And this is a really important concept. Anytime when we're feeding cattle and we're responsible for how much they eat, it's important to understand how to look at dry matter intake. And we usually measure feed intake on a dry matter basis. The water content of feed doesn't carry any nutritional value. Now it does provide water, but there's no extra protein or whatever it might be in that extra water. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, if a steer eats 34 pounds of corn silage as fed, and corn silage is looking at about 35% dry matter, then that 34 pounds times the 35% actually equals about 12 pounds of dry matter. So that same steer, if he eats 14 pounds of grass hay, and grass hay is in the neighborhood of 88% dry matter, we take the 14 times the 0.88, and we end up again about 12 pounds of dry matter. So a steer eating 34 pounds of silage or 14 pounds of grass hay is really eating the same amount of feed on a dry matter basis. So knowing the moisture content of your feed and calculating your intake and your ration on a dry matter basis is really critical. Another thing is to try to understand how much and predict how much you think your cattle are going to eat. So an example I used here is back to our 550-pound steer, and I got them eating about 2.2% of their body weight, and this will vary. They'll eat about 2.2, about 2% or so at first, and then their intake will actually increase over time. I like to figure out an average of about 2.5, but figuring their intake as a percentage of their body weight is a good way to look at it, because the more they eat, or the bigger they get, the more they're going to eat. So if we take this same steer eating 2.2% of their body weight, that's again back to 12 pounds of dry matter. So as we figure their ration and how much energy they need, how much protein they need, knowing how much they're going to eat is really critical in determining what their performance will be. So some of the factors affecting dry matter intake. We talked about body weight. The cattle will tend to eat about the same percentage of their body weight even as they get older. So even though an 800-pound steer is going to eat more than a 500-pound steer, both of them may be eating still in that 2.5% of body weight number. And so it's important. Body weight obviously affects how much they're going to eat. The other one's cattle condition. Oftentimes you'll see thinner cattle that let's say they maybe have a larger framed animal that should weigh around 550 pounds, but they're not very fat. They're fairly thin, and they weigh 475. Well, if you look at that animal as a percentage of the body weight at 475, they're probably going to eat well over that 2.5% of body weight. And in fact, they may eat more like an animal would eat if they weighed 550. So again, when cattle are thinner, or green as the term is, they're likely to eat a little more feed. The other thing is energy level of the diet. So generally speaking, the higher energy the diet is, the lower the intake is going to be. And really, you can think about it somewhat like us people. If you eat nothing but candy bars, you're not going to eat as much of it in terms of pounds, because what starts to regulate your intake are the chemostatic effects, or your blood glucose level tells you to stop eating, as opposed to eating something, I don't know, eating salad maybe. You might get full before your blood glucose level tells you to stop eating. That's the same with cattle. If they're eating a real high forage diet, they're going to eat till they're physically full. If they're eating a high energy diet, they're going to eat until their blood glucose level gets high enough to tell them you've had enough. And so, generally speaking, the higher energy the diet, the lower the intake. The other thing is the environment. Heat definitely reduces dry matter intake. Cattle don't feel like eating. The ruminal digestive process actually produces a lot of heat itself, and so they will definitely back off intake when it gets hot. And generally speaking, when it's colder, cattle will eat more, but I've certainly seen situations when it's really cold and when you've got a lot of wind, the cattle will just bunch up and not eat at all. And this picture here is a good example of that. I took it in a feed yard in Kansas, and these cattle, we had a lot of snow, blowing snow come in, and then it got well below zero with a lot of wind. And we weren't getting cattle to eat in the yard because they were just bunching up trying to stay warm, and they didn't eat as much. So heat and cold both definitely affect the intake. All right, we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the actual weaning process, or weaning the calves themselves. So it's important to ask yourself, what are your goals? Do you, is your goal to sell a weaned calf, and the last you see of them is getting on this truck right here? Or are you going to own them until they look like this heifer here in the feed yard and sell them as a finished animal? You want to start off, obviously, you want to begin with the end in mind. Know where you're going to be going with them. So there's a lot of options. I'm sure there's well more options than what I have listed here, but we can sell the calves at weaning. We can sell them as a preconditioned animal, meaning that they have been weaned off the cow and say for 30 or 45 days, been vaccinated, ready to go. You can background the cattle and then sell them, meaning that they will you're going to keep them and grow them out for 60, 90, 120 days, or whatever it might be. You can retain them till they're finished and look like this girl over here. And then there's lots of different programs you can sell under. There's non-hormone, or known as NHTC, or non-hormone treated cattle. You can sell cattle as non-antibiotic cattle, or all naturals, or all the above, whatever it might be. But knowing what, and I'm not going to get too deep into this. This really isn't about marketing today, but you need to know what you're shooting for when you start off on this venture, especially when you get to the point of, okay, I'm going to wean my calves. What's the end game? What am I going to do with them? And then it's important, lastly, to get paid for what you're doing. And if you are going to precondition those calves, you want to make sure that you've got those cattle sold as preconditioned animals, that you are getting paid for the work you're going to, because the cattle, they're going to require feed, and during that first 30 or 45 days, they may not gain a lot of weight, and so you're also going to vaccinate them, or whatever the buyer wants you to do. So make sure you're getting paid. Also, if you're not going to implant your calves, if you're not going to use antibiotics, make sure that those cattle are going into market where they get a premium, because you are giving up some performance by giving up the technology. So again, begin with the end in mind. Know what direction you're going with the cattle when you make this decisions through the production process. Okay, so a little bit about pre-weaning nutrition. Generally, I found that when you take care of the cow, she's going to take care of the calf. And there may be situations when this is not the case. We can address that a little bit, but generally speaking, you want to make sure that cow is well taken care of. Calves are going to consume mineral. They're going to consume any supplemental feed you feed to that cow. And so having the calf's particularly mineral status in place is really critical. So you're going to need to make sure that the cow has adequate mineral to make sure that calf does as well. And I can tell you that vitamin and mineral nutrition is really critical for optimal health and growth of your calves. And I have seen many times when weaning calves and in the feed yard when cattle have fantastic health at the ranch, and as soon as you take them off that cow, they completely fall apart. Um, and so and oftentimes that's really a case of the vitamin and mineral nutrition maybe being adequate for the animal when they're not under a high stress situation, but as soon as they are weaned off the cow, maybe put on a truck and hauled someplace else, or put in a pen and fed feed they're not familiar with, you're adding some stress to that animal's life, and can really cause some problems if their vitamin and mineral nutrition is not adequate. So once again, you'll hear many times from cow-calf producers, well, the cattle never got sick at the ranch. That's oftentimes true, but when they hit a more stressful part of their life, that's when the fruits of good nutrition or lack of nutrition at the ranch level can come to fruition, and we can oftentimes see some problems. And then, I would say if you're in a situation where your calves are really energy and protein deficient, you've really got a couple of options, but it may be more efficient to feed the calf directly rather than trying to feed that through the cow. That may be in terms of creep feeders, if you've got that option, if you're set up. That's pretty difficult in a range situation. Or if you are running out on range and it's really dry and the calves really aren't growing and doing much, the best thing may be to early wean the calves. And I've seen calves wean quite early and get along okay, but it does take a lot of uh, uh, special nutritional program, especially if they're really young, say in the 120 day age range. But as they get a little bit older, they can usually handle weaning fairly well. And it may be the best thing to do at times to get that calf off the cow, let the cow put some weight on, and feed the calf directly. Just really depends on your pasture or range situation. Okay, so a little bit about weaning itself and weaning management. It's a good idea if you can, and oftentimes, maybe in a range situation, this is difficult to do, but I've seen it be very helpful if you can feed, if you got the calf still on the cow, if you can feed those cows a little something and let the calf recognize whatever you're feeding as feed. That calf will learn from the cow. And whether it's hay, in some cases, a calf may have never seen hay, or any other kind of processed feed, if you can, this is a good idea to do. Let them figure out what feed is a week or two before you actually wean them. So there's lots of different weaning methods, and I've seen them. These all work and can work fine. What's probably most common is just a breath removal. We're taking the calf right off the cow, and it's better to leave the calves where you wean them, especially if you've allowed them to settle and to be with their mama and to suck the cow in that place, and then pull the cows off and take them out of sight and out of earshot if you can. Um, and generally speaking, when you're going to do abrupt removal, I either like to ship those calves immediately or to hold them for 45 days. Um, doing anything in between that can actually be problematic in terms of oftentimes you have a disease process that takes, once they've been stressed and exposed to a different diseases, it takes about 21 days or so to incubate that. So if you pull those calves off, ship them in 2 weeks, you might start to see a lot of problems develop and really hit those cattle with another stress right in the middle of the time that they were going to break anyway. And so it's abrupt removal is fine, it can work, but either chip them immediately or hold them for 45 days and get them fully through the weaning process. Another thing I've seen work that some folks like to do is use these nose flaps. In this example, this calf here, where it prevents the calf from sucking. That allows that calf to stay with the cow, so you don't have the stress of actual removal. but she's no longer sucking the cow or getting any nutrition from that cow. That helps the cow get to where she gets over the process of letting her mammary gland fill up. She works through that, and so she's no longer feeling the pain of not having a calf there, in roughly a week's time, and the calf gets used to not having that contact with the dam in terms from the suckling uh, behavior, and that can kind of ease the stress of weaning. You can pull the calves off, roughly a week later, take the nose flaps on and move on. If that works into your logistics, it can be a good way to do it. Another good way that I think a lot of people have tried, but I've seen work fairly successfully this last little while, and that's fence line weaning. And there's a good example of cows in a fence line weaning situation. You've got the cows on, you split the calves one day off, cows on one side of the fence, calves on the other. In this case, you got a hot wire. You can see it right here to kind of reinforce that fence a little bit. They can see each other, they can stand by each other, but there's no contact. There'll be some balling back and forth across the fence, but it really reduces the stress of weaning, and I've seen it work really, really, really well. Having talked to a lot of guys that have done it, one thing that they will tell you that I found an interesting comment was, sooner or later you're going to have a calf on the wrong side or a cow on the wrong side of the fence. They all have felt that if it's only just one or two or whatever it might be, a real small percentage of the animals you're dealing with, don't stress on cutting them all out. It's more stressful to go in and try to pull them out than just leave that one or two cows on either side, or cows or calves, and then when it's time to pull them apart, you just go ride them out at that time. That having one or two of them on the wrong side of the fence is not the end of the world. But anyway, I've seen this work real good. So there's just a few options there. But one thing I think is really important in the weaning process is avoid dust. If you're going to keep cattle in a pen, you can wet them down prior to weaning, and that doesn't mean make a mud hole out of your pen, but it just wet them down to calm the dust, because as you all know, those calves will walk and walk and walk and create a lot of dust. And the other thing I really like, this is a picture of it here, is to put some bedding in a pen. Oftentimes we only think of bedding when we're dealing with wet weather, but cattle prefer to lay down on forage. They just do. They're more comfortable with it. It's a place for them to gather and to lay down, and it definitely reduces the walking and balling you see when calves are being weaned, and gives them a comfortable place to lay down. When it's real hot, uh, the floor of your pen, if it's dark in color, can be really make it even hotter and more comfortable or more uncomfortable to lay down. So the bedding really adds in that sense as well. And then weather. If you have the ability to work around big weather changes that you see coming down the line, that is also helpful. Not always possible. You might have trucks lined up, you might have everything lined up when you need to go. But if you know there's going to be a big weather front come in, if you can avoid that, let it pass and let the cattle get through that, it can help and reduce your amount of sickness that you might see as well. Okay, a little bit about weaning, and we're talking about a vaccination program. And the thing that I want to make really a stress to all of y'all today or tonight is you want to talk to your veterinarian. I'm going to give you some recommendations and some things that I've seen work, but this discussion does not take the place of consulting with your local vet. They definitely have the expertise, not only educationally, but also in terms of your local area, that I would bring them in the loop. But with that said, just a few thoughts on an overall vaccination program. If with your own calves, if you've got them on the ranch, at branding, I keep it fairly simple, but I like to use a 5-way modified live vaccine that's going to include IBR, BVD, that's type 1 and 2, PI3, and RSV. There's lots of different brand names you can use here, and I won't try to promote any brands, but there's a lot of good ones out there that you can use. But I like to use the modified live as opposed to the killed. I think you get a better response there. Another one I would vaccinate for is a Pasteurella or Mannheimia hemolytica. Um, there are several brands that you can do that are kind of one shot kind of programs. These are some brand names that are out there. There's probably others. We've got Priest-Bronze, Nuplura, or one shot. You can also get some of these in combination with a 5-way modified live vaccine. In that sense, you only have to give one vaccine. So that's really critical. If you want to give one, it makes it simpler. And then some sort of a clostridial vaccine. I have 8-way here. You can probably do 7-way as well, but also dehorn and castrate as well at this time. Don't wait until later. It's way easier on the animal to do it at branding and let the cow take care of that calf after they undergo this process. I don't talk really in this talk about vaccine handling, but I will say as you talk to your vet, that is a super critical point, that vaccines need to be handled properly. They need to be kept cool. You don't want to mix them too far ahead of when you're going to be using them. You don't want to hold mixed vaccine overnight and use it the next day. It's got to be handled properly. The instructions are going to be usually going to be with the product that you buy, but also talk to your vet. But being clean and handling vaccines properly is important. Okay, when it comes to pre-weaning, in an ideal world, which many of you may not deal in, but if you do have the option to vaccinate those calves again right before uh, right before weaning, that's optimal. 2 to 3 weeks before weaning, and I would just repeat this same regimen that we used at branding. Some folks might like to use a different brand of vaccine than you use this time around to give you maybe slightly different coverage. Again, your veterinarian may have some advice along those lines. Um, but again, a lot of folks, this is tough for a lot of people to do because oftentimes you bring in your cattle in off the range, you're going to brand it, you're going to weed them, and go from there. And so this isn't obviously a requirement, but if you can do it, that's great. If not, then when we bring them in at weaning, we're going to repeat this branding regimen. If we don't have the option to pre-wean. The thing I would add to that is deworming. Now, a lot of you folks may feel like you don't have a worm issue in some of these drier climates, and certainly some areas are worse than others, no doubt about it. But when we're looking at the value of cattle today, any depression in performance due to a worm issue is really you're really giving up quite a bit. So I would use two different types of wormers. You can use a pour-on and injectable. There's multiple brands in this category. They'll hit both internal and external parasites, and also use some sort of a white wormer. It's all specific for, it's a drench, all specific for internal parasites, and it will cover some internal parasites that are not covered by your pour-on and injectable. Again, when we're looking at the value of cattle today, and I'm going to probably say that more than once, you really want to look hard at that. And then lastly is some sort of a mass treatment with antibiotics. Again, you're going to need to talk to your veterinarian. You're likely going to need a prescription for the antibiotics and talk about your risk factors. I've seen it work really well to just go ahead and treat all the animals with antibiotics. Obviously, if they are going into some sort of a non-antibiotic program or whatever it might be, that's not an option. But I do think this should be a consideration. Um, I'm not saying that you have to do it or you should or not, but make sure you think about it, your specific situation, talk to your vet, and see what you think might be best. Okay, we're going to talk about water again real quick. Can't overdo this one. We talked about keeping it clean. Water tanks need to be cleaned. Cattle dribble all kinds of feed and all kinds of stuff in their water tank. And if you've got small waterers, they really, especially during the weaning time, during that, say, 3 weeks or so, really highly stressful time, I'd be cleaning those waters every day. It's not hard to do. If you're in the cattle, you're checking them, you can pull the plug out of that tank, scrub it out real quick, fill it back up. They've always got clean water. That may not be possible depending on your water tank situation, but ideally that's would be good to do. The other thing is to try to set up to prevent cattle from standing in the water. You can see these big Holstein steers in here, and Holsteins are worse than any others about like getting into mischief and causing problems. But a lot of times your cattle will like to stand in the water, and it's just like this tub here. Cattle could easily stand in it. So you want to try to set things up so it's more difficult for them to stand in the water. The other one is easy access. You don't want a mud hole around your water tank. You don't want it too tall. And when you look at the reason that this tub is in this pen is we wanted to be sure that these cattle found the water tank. And the water tank is here in the fence line. Sometimes they may have difficulty finding it, whatever it might be. Do not want to let water intake be a problem. And so you can even go to this point of having a temporary tank that you might fill in some other manner to make sure these cattle are finding the water. And again, I hit this last point is, can they find the water? It's interesting, and I've seen over the years, some sets of cattle have trouble finding water for whatever reason. You can do a lot of different things. These cattle may have never had a drink out of a water tank. They may never even had a drink out of a pond. It may all be live water, depending on your range situation or where you bought the cattle from. They may have difficulties understanding where water is. I've seen guys let water tanks overflow just for, say, a day or a short period of time, just to let cattle know where it's at. Maybe when they first come into a pen, they can see and hear that water running. I'm also seeing extending a garden hose, a short length of garden hose to the end of the faucet in the outtake in the water tank. Loop it up over the fence and let it drip in or run into the water tank that way as well. Anything to let them know where the water's at can be helpful. Just a quick story. Several years ago, saw a group of cattle that all came from the same ranch into a grow yard facility, shipped into their ranch over several days. But there was one pen of cattle that came in, and after several days, started not to look good. They weren't eating any feed. It was hot. All the other cattle were fine. Same pen, or the pens right next to each other, but one set just looked really bad. And so the folks that were taking care of them came over and asked me to take a look at them. I went out and looked at them, and boy, they looked rough. And so I suggested that he pull the plug out of the water tank. And so we went over and did that, and those cattle immediately ran to that water tank. And the reality of it is that they were standing in a pen with a water tank. All the cattle around them had no problems with the water tank. They did not find the water. That's rare, but it does happen. So always be aware that if cattle are not eating, the first thing you want to look at is water, and make sure they know where the water's at. All right, just some general guidelines on feeding. First of all, it's good to feed familiar feeds. If you know the cattle have seen certain types of feed before, it's good to feed them something that they're going to know what it is. And then the other thing is quality matters, and we'll talk a little bit about quality here in a minute with regard to alfalfa hay. But when cattle first come on feed, they don't eat very much. When they're learning how to, in many cases, learning how to stick their head through a feed bunk or through a hay feeder or whatever it might be, if they've never done that before, that's a foreign thing to them. So figuring out how to eat, we need to make it really easy, but we need to make every bite count when they're not eating very much feed. We want to start them a starter hay to be fairly familiar and palatable. So clean, high quality grass hay may be preferred to alfalfa if it's more familiar. Now, high quality grass hay is not as nutrient dense as alfalfa is. That kind of is a little bit in conflict with what I just said a second ago. But if they're not used to eating alfalfa, if they've never eaten it, then they do recognize the grass, that you're better off getting a higher volume of feed into them. So just kind of watch that. And I also don't like to feed silages in a starter diet. If you're in a situation where you can feed silage, oftentimes the smell of silage is very different, and it's not something you want to start them on. I like to feed a free choice palatable mineral in the pen. This would be a loose mineral. There are several companies that make kind of a high stress mineral, whatever it might be. You can make it available to those calves for the first, say, 3 weeks. Let them eat that. They get their vitamins and trace minerals. And oftentimes, they'll eat a good palatable mineral when they maybe won't stick their head in a feed bunk because they'll want the salt content, and you can get them to eat a little bit of mineral. Anything we can get into them early on, especially if it's those vitamins and trace minerals, can be helpful. You just leave it in the pen for a few weeks. After you get the cattle up on feed good, you can pull it out of the pen and not continue to need to feed that. And then as we introduce new feeds, you can do that after 2 or 3 days when the cattle get acclimated to putting their head in the bunk and starting to eat. Then you can introduce some sort of mixed ration or pelleted feed or whatever you might be feeding. Just top dress it lightly on top of the hay that they're eating, and they'll start to pick it up with the hay. So some health concerns with weaning. First of all, there's really just two that are major concerns. One's coccidiosis, which would show up as a bloody scours. And really, all rations you feed should be supplemented with some sort of or the supplement should contain some sort of coccidiostat. Several of them out on the market. You've got Decox, Bovatec, Rumensin, and then Amprolium or Corid. All of those can be effective coccidiostat. They really have somewhat different roles. Bovatec and Rumensin also improve feed efficiency and gain as well, whereas Decox and Amprolium really are just specifically for coccidiosis. The nice thing about Amprolium is you can put it both in the feed or the water, and so that can be a good way to get it in the feed, but you really just want to address coccidiosis before it starts. So be on top of that, and that's something to discuss with your nutritionist or feed company rep or whoever it is that's helping you get the right feeds put together. They're likely going to bring it up as well, but just be aware that definitely does make a difference. The other piece is your respiratory disease. And I think the first point is that good weaning and nutrition and vaccination program is the best preventive. The more you can do on a front end, the more those cattle are going to be prepared to handle the stresses of weaning and learning a new feed. Other prevention options are, we talked a little bit earlier about a prophylactic antibiotic treatment, but make sure you're talking to your vet about that. And what I mean by that is treat every animal when you at initial processing. You can also utilize feed grade antibiotics, such as an example would be CTC. There's others that can be fed for a period of time. In some cases, you can do both. You can utilize an injectable on the front end, and then use feed grade antibiotics later in the feeding period, say day 10 or 20 or down the road. But I think the important thing to remember about feed grade antibiotics is that they are a better prevention than they are a treatment. Once cattle are sick, I'm not a big believer in feed grade antibiotics making that big of a difference, but I have seen it make a difference on the front end, and really it may be involved in help with from a digestion standpoint as much as it is help with respiratory problems. But obviously, digestive issues end up rolling into a respiratory problem with cattle inevitably. So anyway, these are some things to talk to your vet about and that you have to think about. The other thing is to set up a treatment protocol ahead of time, again in consultation with your vet. So when an animal gets sick, gets a respiratory issue, which antibiotic are you going to use first? Which one are you going to use second? Say in a second treatment or a third, and set this up ahead of time, and then stick with it. Stick with it long enough to see what's working and what's not working. Many times folks want to skip around and use this drug and use that drug, and at the end of the day, they really have no idea what's working and what's not working. And so stick with the protocol. Work it out with your vet and stick with it. You're going to want to maintain some records, record the treatments, know which calf number, what product they use, the date. You can oftentimes, if you don't have IDs on your calves, you can just ID the cattle you treat. Put a number in it, the product and the date. That way you will know as you're looking at the cattle later, especially if you have more than just a few. When you're looking at them later, you'll know, hey, I treated that animal on the 23rd of October or whatever it might be. So you'll know how long it's been since their last treatment and know how long you should give them before you should look at treating them again, especially if you're using a long acting antibiotic. Excuse me. Okay, I went backwards here. Sorry about that. The last thing I had there was to stay on label. Stay on label with your with the antibiotics. Use them as they are prescribed to be used and under the direction of your vet. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the next phase in terms of feeding programs and that kind of thing. And the first thing I'd tell you is get the right help. So I like this picture. This young lady, if you've got a branding, you better invite her. She can help you do anything you need to have done, and she can especially help you get calf fries to be thrown on the fire because she's dang good at that. Um, so to start off with, know what you're feeding. You're going to want to get some forage analysis. And I would say get some analysis on every different type of forage you're feeding. And if you've got forages from different locations, let's say you're feeding some three-way small grains hay, whatever it might be, but you've got it from different fields or bought it from different buyers, you're going to want to do more than one analysis because they're not going to be all the same. But your basal part of your diet, which is going to be your forage, make sure you analyze it. See what you're starting with. Next would be water. Mentioned that earlier. You don't need to test your water all the time unless you're changing water sources, but you're going to want to test your water to know if you've got some mineral issues that are going to be causing problems for you, whether it's in terms of water intake or going to be an antagonist for some trace minerals so you can figure out how to mitigate those issues. Again, doesn't need to be done all the time, but it needs to be done often enough, maybe every few years just to know what you have, as long as you're not changing water sources. And then the other one is to utilize your local expertise. I know we've got expertise there at the county extension office. You've also got your feed company representatives, which folks are usually quite knowledgeable, and then a nutritionist, whether they work for a feed company or some other form of nutritional help. You're going to want to make sure you're checking back with them and getting a good balanced diet put together. So there's really too many scenarios for me to go into everybody's possible scenarios. So I've broken them down in just really three very simple scenarios in terms of what you might want to look for. But I didn't attempt today to actually balance any rations for you because it's going to be so location specific. But we'll first start off with some sort of a grass or small grains like a triticale hay, which I think is pretty common. Most of the time, that's going to be you're going to need to add some additional protein and energy to this type of a feed if you're just going to feed hay and say some kind of supplement. You can buy a bagged, pelleted, or meal supplement that will compensate with some energy and protein there. I'm sure that commercial manufacturers have this type of thing available. You're going to want to make sure that they're fortified with all of your macro and trace minerals and vitamins. And then again, we talked about the potential medication for coccidiosis control and improved feed efficiency. So I would definitely use Rumensin and Bovatec, or Bovatec in terms from a feed efficiency standpoint. Both can have some effect on the coccidiosis. Rumensin tends to be a little stronger with coccidiosis, so oftentimes if you want to feed Bovatec, you can feed Decox with that. But make sure you address the issue of coccidiosis on the front end, and also get the advantage of the improved feed efficiency by feeding these products. And then the other thing you can look at is some sort of a commodity mix. I know there's some feed companies that feed or that can provide kind of a mix of DDG and corn. That's a nice mix of energy and protein. And I believe that mix is probably more predominantly corn, which is what you need more of in this case is more energy, just a little bit of protein. And I'm sure you can get that with a fortified mineral mix mixed in, or maybe you feed that separately. But again, think about the medication portion of that to improve feed efficiency and protect against coccidiosis. And the other, which might be quite common, is if you're going to use alfalfa hay as your basal forage supplement. And certainly good alfalfa hay can be both a protein and energy supplement. So in a lot of cases, if you're feeding alfalfa, you don't need a lot of extra protein. And so you could potentially feed just a grain mix, or maybe maybe a DDG corn mix with that as well. And then once again, let's make sure we're fortified with minerals that will balance alfalfa specifically, and medicated as we've talked about above there. One note, I think folks with alfalfa hay, when we want to buy the very best of the best, and I can tell you, if you've got good, clean, not real dusty, no mold, stuff like that, but just good, clean, feeder quality alfalfa, that may be better than looking at really super high quality alfalfa in terms of avoiding bloat. And then also cattle can get really loose on high quality alfalfa. You got the high protein and mineral content of alfalfa can cause some problems here that may add more digestive stress than it's worth in terms of having a super high quality hay. So again, I'm not talking about buying junky alfalfa, but just good clean hay. But having the real high test alfalfa is probably not necessary. It may require you to be a little careful on how you feed it. Okay, and then there's always a total mixed ration. Again, there's a myriad of ways to putting this together, so I'm not going to try to really put a ration together per se, but you've got your basal forage content of your diet, which can be some ground hay or straw mixed with silage, be it corn silage, triticale silage, alfalfa, whatever it might be, is going to be your basic forage piece. Make sure it's analyzed, as we mentioned earlier. And then you're going to add some sort of a commodity with grains, corn, rural barley, or wheat, whatever it might be to add energy to the diet. Likely going to need a little bit added protein. Could be a DDG, a soy meal, canola meal, whatever it might be. Again, work with your nutritionist on this one. And then you may need some sort of a mineral balancer. A lot of times you can buy a bagged mineral balancer that will contain Rumensin or Bovatec or Decox or whatever it might be. And so, your ration will look kind of like this. You're going to mix it all together in your truck, and you'll end up having cattle eat out of a bunk that looks like that. A lot of y'all are already doing this, of course. So I want to look at the economics a little bit of background in cattle. And of course, the situation's all changed from year to year. But we're going to start off just talking about some of the terms and things you want to think about if you want to background your own calves or buy some cattle to background. And some of these terms are things you all know, but I'll just throw some things up there. When we talk about average daily gain or ADG, we're talking about the total weight gain divided by the number of days on feed. That's pretty intuitive. Dry matter intake, we talked about that. That is the daily feed intake on a dry matter basis. Again, looking at everything on a dry matter basis is really critical, so we know exactly what that animal is taking in and not just the moisture content. Feed conversion, real important economically, and that's going to be your dry matter intake divided by your average daily gain. It's going to be a number like 6.5 or 7 or 5.5 or whatever it might be. The lower the number, the better, and that means that the cattle are gaining more for the amount of feed that they eat. Death loss, pretty self-explanatory what death loss is, but it's an important factor in profitability. Your ration cost, thinking about it in terms of dollars a ton. Again, think about it on a dry matter basis. Everything we think about with feed related, whether it's feed conversion, dry matter intake, or ration cost, think about it on a dry matter basis. Processing costs. What is it costing you to vaccinate, deworm, implants? If you're medicating with antibiotic or whatever it might be, but you want to have that figured in, and then any other medicine costs for treatments. How much are these cattle going to get sick, and what's it going to cost you to treat them when and if they do get sick? Some additional considerations: yardage cost. So a lot of folks, may not have a good feel for what this costs, but it's important for you to try to figure out what it costs you on a per head per day basis to feed those cattle. And really, it's all expenses except your feed and med costs. So it's labor. It's it's equipment, it's fuel, it's repair and maintenance, it's depreciation. Anything else that is supporting your feeding enterprise, utilities, freight, interest, insurance, anything else it might be. But it's important that as we're trying to figure out the the viability and profitability of the feeding venture, you're going to need to know what this number is. Okay, and I can tell you, in a commercial feed yard today, you're probably looking at, in the neighborhood of 45 to 50 cents a head a day. Likely a smaller operation might be a little bit more than that, or it could be a little less, depending on what your overhead costs are. A lot of times a big feed yard's going to have a lot of overhead costs that you may not have. But it's good to try to figure out and come up with a number what you think that cost is. Okay, cost of gain. That's your total cost on a per animal basis divided by the total gain. Or you can look at it as a whole. If you've got 100 head, your total cost on that 100 head divided by the total gain of the 100 head. And this is excluding cattle costs. We're just looking at that added gain. So if they come in weighing 500 pounds and they go out weighing 800 pounds, we're looking at that 300-pound gain. What did it cost you to put that on? Important concept as we're trying to figure out profitability. Now this next one is something that gets confusing for a lot of people, and that is the value of the gain. So that is the change in the per head cattle value divided by the weight gain. So I give a little example here. If we purchase a 550-pound steer at $295 per hundredweight, that's going to be $1,622 and change. Okay, if we're going to sell an 850-pound steer, and I just pulled a number out here at $242 a hundredweight, that's a little over $2,000, $2,057. So these cattle gained 300 pounds. Their change in value, which is this difference in number here, $434.50, meaning that these cattle brought you back another $434 as sold as an 850 pounder than they did as a 550 pounder. So if we take that change in value, which is we're here, and divide that by the weight gain, 300 pounds, the value of that gain is $1.44. Now the goal that we're shooting for is we want the value of the gain to be more than the cost of gain. That seems pretty intuitive. If it's costing us more than we're gaining in value, we don't want to do it. And so understanding that difference is real critical. And I'm going to give you some feeding examples here in just a minute. Okay, anytime you're selling cattle, I think a lot of y'all know this, but the slide that cattle are worth less per pound as they get heavier. And I'm sure all of you have noticed that slide over the years is sometimes wider than others. Say the difference between a 5-weight and a 6-weight steer, some years that difference or slide is more than it is other years. In general, our slide decreases as our corn price increases, or the slide is going to decrease as feedlot cost goes up. Bottom line being, heavier cattle do not eat as much corn to get fat. So put it in another way, is it's cheaper for the cattle feeder to buy the weight from you than it is for him to put the weight on in the feed yard. Now, when corn's cheap, then it's cheaper for him to put the weight on than it is to buy the extra weight. And that's when the slide is wider, or they're willing to pay a little more for lighter cattle, if that makes sense. Okay, and the in cost or value, really you're talking about starting weight. Typically, most cattle purchased off the ranch that have not been on feed are around 2% shrink, so you're going to want to figure that in your starting weight when you're figuring up our cost. So it'll be 2% shrink by the purchase price. That gives you your total value. We want, if you're purchasing the cattle, make sure you include the freight delivered to your place. Otherwise, we want to look at an opportunity cost. If you're just retaining your own calves, what would you have sold your calves for? And that should be your starting point. Not what you have in them, but what you would have sold them for. And then sale price, typically cattle coming out of a backgrounding yard or that have been on feed, they're bigger, they're going to have a bigger rumen, it's going to hold more feed, and so we typically shrink those cattle a little bit more. But for the sake of us doing an analysis or a break even on the cattle, which we'll do here in just a minute, we're looking at an actual or an estimated sale weight, and then we won't include any freight on that because we're going to assume that our seller is going to pick up the cattle at the yard. If that's not the case, then we need to figure that in. Okay, so some things that affect cattle feeder or calf and feeder cattle pricing. So what the person who is buying the cattle from you, or if it's you buying the cattle, what are you thinking about in terms of what you're willing to pay for an animal? And this is important if we're going to try to forecast what we think. If we're going to retain our calves, we need to forecast what we think those calves are going to be worth in 3, 4, 5 months down the road. And so some things to think about. First of all, just simple supply demand. What affects supply demand? Well, there's a cattle cycle. It's a multi-year cycle, and really it's based on cow numbers. Um, Cow numbers go up or go down as there's less profitability in a business. They go up when there's more profitability in a business. These things don't happen in a few months or even in a year. The supply demand change usually takes a few years to change. So right now, for example, we are in a very tight cattle supply market. So generally speaking, we're in a tight, the demand is tight, the supply is tight, and there's big demand for calves. So that's why you're seeing the kind of prices that you are. Um, Other thing that affects supply is supply demand can also be seasonal. So within that overall cattle cycle, we can see some seasonality to it. This isn't always true, but typically, particularly in the West, you're looking at lower calf prices in the fall. Just because there's a lot of calves available, they have to get on a truck and go somewhere. And if there's a lot of them available, you're gonna try to buy them cheaper if you're a buyer. Sometimes you can see a little bump in the late fall or early winter if there's good grass conditions, be it on wheat pasture or winter grass in California or wherever it might be. And this year might be kind of interesting. It's been really dry in a lot of wheat country in the middle part of the country, but it's supposed to get some good rains here, I think, pretty quick. That can make a big difference because wheat pasture is a great way to put weight on cattle, especially particularly light cattle right off the cow, if it's available. But it definitely requires moisture to get that going. So that's not always there. Okay, they're also looking at cattle futures. So buyers that are looking at buying your cattle, or when you're looking at projecting what a sale price would be, are looking at potential sale prices. So if you're buying feeder cattle, or for feeder, you want to look at feeder cattle futures. You're looking at 3 to 4 months down the road from weaning time. Okay, so if you're weaning your calves now, you're looking at either the March or the January or March feeder. That kind of gives you on the cattle futures. That kind of gives you an idea of what those cattle might be worth 3 or 4 months down the road. If you're looking at selling live cattle or fed cattle, and you want to finish them, then you're looking more like 8 or 9 months down the road. So for weaning the calves now, we're going to want to see, okay, what does the June or the August live cattle look like? And an increase in live cattle prices just about always causes an increase in feeder cattle prices as well. And the other is corn futures. Corn is certainly the largest cost in feeding cattle. So as corn price increases, you'll typically see a decrease in feeder cattle prices. So feeder cattle really rely on what's going on with the live cattle market and also the corn futures. One rule of thumb here with corn, it's kind of good to remember, is a 10 cent a bushel move in corn, and these are ballpark numbers, but they're a little easier to remember. I rounded them off. So 1 10 cent a bushel move in corn will increase the ration price about $7 a ton in a feedlot. That increases your cost of gain about $2 a hundredweight. That equates to about $16 a head on a steer, or about $3 per hundredweight on a 500-pound steer. So as you see corn go up and down, you can figure that's about a $3 a hundredweight swing on your steers. Very tight relationship here. Good rule of thumb and thing to remember. So I just went and pulled these graphs off the futures the other day. You've got October feeder futures at uh, uh, showing a graph here for October 2024. We've got April live, so your feeder cattle are really going to be keying off this April live cattle market. And then we've got December corn here. So you can see this feeder market and the April live cattle market graphs look almost exactly the same. And then the December corn market looks a little different. You can see your general downtrend in corn prices, but it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. When cattle supplies are tight, like it is this year, you'll see this kind of relationship a lot. The corn doesn't have as big a factor. Live cattle really is driving feeder cattle prices. When there's high big cattle supplies, then corn has a bigger impact on feeder cattle prices because cattle are available and feeders just want to know, okay, how cheap can I feed them? There's been a lot of years where you'll see this chart look exactly like this one. This year's not one of them. Look a little different. Although if you look at it, the general shape of the graph is similar, okay, but it's not quite as identical as you get here. But again, feeder cattle prices are going to be keyed off both the live and the corn. Okay, so I'm going to work up a couple pricing scenarios for 550 pound steer. I'm gonna run you some break evens here. So we figure that at 295 100 weight, we're going to figure them at 120 days on feed. We're going to figure our intake at 2.5% of body weight. And in this case, for a break even, I'm using the average body weight. Okay, so the way you come up, sorry, I need a drink there. The way you come up with an average body weight is to take the starting weight plus your projected ending weight, which is going to be, let's see, well, in this case, I made it at 850 pounds. Okay, so that gives us an average of 670 times 2.5% of body weight, or the cattle will eat about 16.75 pounds. For our example, I used a hay cost at 110, and that's going to make up about 84% of the diet. So this is just a simple hay and DDG corn kind of a diet. I've got the DDG and corn and mineral supplementation at $400 a ton. It's going to make up 16% of the diet. So that gives us a ration cost of $177 a ton dry matter. Now I plugged the yardage cost in here at 40 cents a head a day. Again, you need to kind of figure out what that is for you. And so looking at this break even, this is a little spreadsheet that I've worked on over the years to kind of calculate all this. We're going to make this available on the extension website. It isn't quite yet, but it will be. So you can kind of run some scenarios yourself. But again, purchase cost here, $295. In this case, I have the cattle gaining 2.5 pounds a day. And again, come back, they're eating at 16.7 pounds. I think it's what we figured it at. 120 days. So that has them converting it to 6.7. I got death loss in at 1.5 and our ration cost in at 177. Our medicine in at 16 bucks a head. And that is processing medicine together. Then you got brands and dues and check off and all that, a little over $2. So in this case, these cattle break even at 222, 100 weight. And when I figured that at the time I did this, the feeder futures in March was at 248. It's actually less than that now. I looked at the spread between, using cattle facts, looked at the spread between how much of a slide we would look at between a 750 weight, which is our base weight, and what they went to. It's about $13 a hundredweight. And so these cattle would sell at 248 minus the $13, which would be 235, break even at 222. We won't need to go through every one of these numbers except to say our calculations here is saying that our cost of gain, 89 cents, and our value of gain is $1.25. Nice good spread there. And so if we look at this scenario, we should make about 106 bucks a head on these cattle by feeding them, again, if we get this kind of gain in feed conversion. Next scenario, same set of cattle, everything's the same, except I've just got them gaining 2 pounds a day instead of 2.5. They're eating the same amount of feed, so that makes our conversion not quite as good at 8.4. If you remember, the other one was 6.7, if I remember correctly. Everything else is the same, but that difference in average daily gain. So they sold for at 790 pounds instead of 850. You sold a 790 pounder. A $13 slide, but since they were not as far off the base weight, the slide discount's only a little over $5. So we sold the cattle for $242.80, a break even of $239. So you can see our break even was quite a bit higher. We were $222 before. Total cost of gain at $112 versus the 2.5 pound gain was at 89 cents. Total value gain pretty similar. So in this case, the cattle made a little over $26 per head of the lower gain. So just to compare these, 2 pound gain versus 2.5, outlay of 790 versus 850. You see the difference in the feed conversion, your cost of gain a lot better with your higher gain, and that's pretty intuitive. And your break even at 239 and 222. So we're looking at about an $80 a head difference to get another half pound. Now, I just use this as an example to let you see how much difference a little difference in performance can make and how important it is to try to estimate these numbers to the best of your ability, because an $80 a head swing may decide, hey, I want to feed these cattle or I don't. And again, getting the help of some outside help to help you run these break evens and run a good ration is important. So just to give you an idea of the sensitivity of this analysis to ration cost, in this case, I increased the ration cost from a 177 to 207. So I took it up $30. Used the same 2.5 pound gain. So all this is the same, but that took our cost of gain from 89 cents to $1. Value gain doesn't change because of the way we sold the cattle. Our break even went up to 226. And a P&L of $76 or $30 a head less than what we had than what we projected with the lower ration cost. So again, ration cost is critical, and estimating it to the best of your ability is pretty important rather than just swagging it. Also show you a little difference in what death loss makes. We had them in at 1.5%. If we went with the same 2.5 pound gain scenario, if I plugged them in at 5.5%. Took our cost of gain from 89 cents up to 111. Our break even from 222 to 230, and our P&L all the way down to $41 versus 106 that we figured before. So again, important to control this as much as you can, obviously, but also there's a lot of factors in feeding cattle and being profitable, and you want to try to project what you're going to do before you ever make the decision to feed them. So just in closing, some market information that's available. There's market information on the USU Extension site. You can look at this the website here, and we'll make this available to you. There's also free information on the USDA site, and there's some other sources of information. I know there's more than just these. I'm not getting paid by any of them, but there's Cattle Facts, there's DTN, there's Livestock Market Information Center, all of which are paid to give you as much market information as they can. All of them are good and have good value. You can get some of that same information free from these two sources as well. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Again, I'm just going to leave that on the screen, but you can get a hold of me or email me at david.sechrist@usu.edu. Happy to visit with you about backgrounding some cattle if you have a desire to do so. Thank you.